reasons, I want to advise that the session is being recorded for future reference and clarity as required. The recording will be stored on the Cost of Service Methodology Review webpage at www.saspower.com. It will remain in this site until it is no longer serving a business purpose and/or has met its retention period. By staying in the Teams meeting, you are consenting to being recorded for the purposes outlined. After the session, the link to the recording will be shared once it's downloaded and saved, as will a copy of this presentation. So it'll be, again, on that Cost of Service website. Today, we'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is hosted from the traditional territory of the Treaty 4 Nations and the home of the Métis. We make this acknowledgement in the spirit of reconciliation because we are all treaty people as we each make our homes in the traditional territory of the Indigenous people of Canada. For those of you that have participated in a SaskPower related meeting in the past too, you'll also recognize the fact that we like to start meetings with safety moments. Because we're in this spring period where it's just inevitable, especially here in Saskatchewan, that these significant windstorms can pop up out of the blue. We're going to talk a little bit about what to do in case you come across a fallen power line. So again, always assume that wires are energized, stay at least 10 meters away and call 911, and never try to move a down power line on your own. If you happen to be in a vehicle, similar to the image on the screen, first and foremost, stay inside your vehicle. If it's not safe to stay inside, keep your feet together and hold arms tightly at your sides. Jump clear without touching your vehicle. And finally, hop away from vehicle with feet together once it's safe to do so. Finally, I think I am going to turn it over to John and Andrew shortly. Before I do, though, I just wanted to recognize a few other individuals who are participating on the call today. First, we have the Saskatchewan Rate Review Panel Chair and Vice Chair, Mr. Albert Johnston and Dwayne Hyunga, as well as a number of other board or panel members participating today. And we've also got Jerry Forrest, one of the technical consultants for the Rate Review Panel. And finally, I would just like to thank everybody who's primarily our most important customers for taking the time today and having listened to what John Todd and Andrew Blair from Allocation are going to discuss with us today in terms of their review of SaskPower's current cost of service rate design methodologies. So I think with that, I see Andrew on the screen, so maybe I'll start by turning it over to Andrew.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third public meeting of the 2023 Cost Allocation and Rate Design Review. Go to the next slide, please. We'll start with a brief description of the project and background on cost allocation methodologies. We'll move on to our review and recommendations. Then we'll go to a summary and a selection of the survey responses and discuss next steps. Next slide, please. I'm Andrew Blair, a senior consultant with Allocation, and John Todd, the president of Allocation, is also here today. John founded Allocation over 40 years ago and has worked with utilities, regulators, and consumer groups all across Canada. And Allocation previously reviewed cost allocation and rate design methodologies for SaskPower in 2012 and 2017. Go to the next slide, please. So our task is to review SaskPower's cost allocation methodology and examine the functionalization, classification, and allocation methodologies across Canada and a couple of utilities in the United States as well. Following that review, we're making recommendations to SaskPower, which were provided in a draft report that was circulated last week. So today is the presentation, and the final report will be submitted on June 30th. Next slide. We're going to start with the background on cost allocation methodologies. This is mostly what we've gone through in previous meetings, and we plan to go through this section relatively quickly because we expect most of you here today joined us in previous meetings. But please raise your hand or ask any questions if you'd like to go anything in more detail. So here's a schematic of SaskPower's electricity system from the generation system on the left through to the high voltage grid to substations and a few more levels of radio lines and voltage step downs at substations and transformers as it reaches end-use customers at the distribution level. At the top of the image, you can see the different types of equipment and how it is all functionalized from generation to transmission to distribution and then to customer services. These are the 4 functions that SaskPower's assets and costs are organized into. Lower down in the schematic to the right, we see the different types of customers, different rate classes that are served at different voltages. Customers only pay for the parts of the system they use. So a large industrial customer there is connected directly to the transmission system, so they do not pay any distribution costs. There are also losses at each step along the way, and those losses are attributed to the parts of the system that each customer class uses. It's generally pretty easy to attribute specific assets and costs to these functions, but a bit more difficult for general assets like SaskPower's head office or administration costs. Next slide. There's some differences in cost allocation methodologies used by different utilities, but there are some common attributes and principles. If costs can be directly attributed to a specific class, they are, but that's pretty uncommon. Street lighting equipment can be attributed to the street lighting class, so they're directly allocated, but most assets and costs are shared among classes. The main criterion for allocating cost is cost causality. Who is causing the cost to be incurred, who is consuming electricity that needs to be generated, or who is consuming electricity at peak times and creating the need for capacity investments. The goal is fair and reasonable rates, so it costs money to provide electricity to customers across the province. And if those costs aren't recovered from the customers that are causing the costs, then they're being recovered from customers that aren't causing the costs, and we want to avoid that situation. Go to the next slide. The 3 steps in cost allocation are first functionalization, and classification, and allocation. The first costs are grouped by function. Those functions are assigned to cost drivers, which is the categorization and classification stage. And then those costs are allocated to classes based on each class's share of those cost drivers. Next slide. So functionalization is the first step, and it groups similar assets and expenses. These groupings are generally aligned with SaskPower's system of accounts. The 4 functions I mentioned earlier, generation, transmission, distribution, and customer service, are then further divided into sub-functions. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, different functions can apply to different customers. The transmission system connects to certain large industrial customers, but also feeds into the distribution system that serves other customers. Next slide. The second step is classification. Costs can be classified as demand-related, which is to meet peak capacity or peak demands. They can be classified as energy-related or customer-related. It's common for part of an asset or expense to be split between multiple classifications. For example, the cost of a lower voltage distribution line is driven in large part by the number of customers the lines need to reach, but the lines also need sufficient capacity for everyone to be able to use electricity when they need it. So part of the cost is also driven by peak demands. The low voltage line subfunction is classified partially to demand related and then partially to customer related. And similar for generation is also split between demand and energy. Go to the next slide, please. The classified costs are then allocated to SaskPower's customer classes by each class's relative energy consumption or demands or the number of customers, or in some cases, the weighted number of customers. And this gives us the total cost allocated to each customer class. So SaskPower's full annual budget is divided among rate classes, and then this is compared to the revenue collected from each class. Next slide. The ratio of a class's revenues to the class's cost is analyzed, and if revenues collected at current rates deviate substantially from the allocated costs, then rates are rebalanced. Theoretically, if the ratio is exactly 1.00, then the customer class is paying exactly its costs. In practice, there is some judgment in this analysis. Cost allocation can be more of an art than a science. So a range of reasonableness is used instead of setting everything back to 1.00 every time. It would also cause rates to fluctuate quite a bit over time. Using this range, if the ratio is lower than 0.95 or higher than 1.05, there's adjustment to bring the rates within the range. Next slide, please. An important concept in cost allocation is the load factor, which is a relationship between average energy and peak demands. This graph is based on sample residential load data from 2015 and 2017. Allocating costs by electricity consumption is most relevant for fuel used in generation. Most of the utilities costs are actually related to capacity, from the size of the generator to the transmission lines to substations and distribution lines. Each step along the way, the equipment needs to be large enough to meet peak demands. So if the peak, that's around 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. in this graph, that's what's causing a lot of SaskPower's investments to be incurred. Moving to the next slide. Overall, the principles underlining SaskPower's cost allocation and rate design are aligned with a set of principles called the Bary principles, which are commonly referenced in rate making across North America. The attributes of sound rate structure ensure SaskPower receives an appropriate and stable level of revenue to operate. Customers pay an appropriate price for the costs they cause, and rates are set in a practical way without unnecessary complexity or controversy. Next slide. SaskPower's stated principles are aligned with the Bary principles. These principles are meeting the revenue requirement, fairness and equity, economic efficiency, conservation of resources, simplicity and administrative ease, and stability and gradualism. To the next slide. Okay, now I'll move on to our recommendations on the next slide. Our recommendations are based on a review of other jurisdictions and a review of SaskPower's model, in addition to discussions with SaskPower staff and our experiences in other jurisdictions. Next slide. Overall, SaskPower follows a traditional approach that aligns with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, their electricity utility cost allocation manual, and also what is being used in other jurisdictions. I'll point out this is now the third review of SaskPower's cost allocation methodologies, and SaskPower has made a number of changes since 2012. So we're finding that there aren't substantial differences between SaskPower and other jurisdictions at this point. Next slide. This is the first review, though, that included a review of functionalization methods. So we'll be spending a bit more time on that. The first two studies focused on classification and allocation only. Functionalizations are standardized across utilities. However, in jurisdictions that are deregulated, that deregulation broke up the utilities into the functions. So in Ontario and Alberta, there are separate generation utilities, transmission utilities, and distribution utilities. And distribution utilities generally handle the customer care function. So our review focused on the level of subfunction detail. Subfunctions are generally aligned with the way utilities organize their own costs in the system of accounts or in their financial system statements. Go to the next slide. Here's a summary of SaskPower's functions and subfunctions. We'll go through each of these functions separately. Go to the next slide, please. The generation subfunction has 9 subfunctions. All generators are included jointly, and the subfunctions are delineated by the purpose of generation rather than the source of generation. Also notably, there are separate load and losses subfunctions. Go to the next slide. The transmission function has 4 subfunctions. And they're separated into substations and lines of different voltages. Go to the next slide, please. The distribution function has 10 subfunctions. Streetlights are included as their own subfunction, which is directly classified and allocated to that class. There's also customer contributions included as its own subfunction. The amounts in this function are attributable to the other subfunctions and are classified and allocated in a way that offsets the associated functions. So if there is a contribution for a distribution main, for example, that contribution is used to offset the distribution main subfunction. So it's offsetting the cost that is then allocated to the rate classes. To the next slide, please. The customer services function has 6 subfunctions. The labeling of the other functions is standardized. The generation, transmission, and distribution is standard across utilities, but the customer services function can take many names. Here it's called customer services, but it's also often referred to just as customer care or retail services. Go to the next slide, please. So we have a few recommendations related to functionalization, but they're limited to the restructuring of subfunctions and don't actually impact cost allocation or rate design results at this point. Unlike other recommendations we've made, these are sort of recommendations to consider or soft recommendations. While there's some benefit to being consistent with other jurisdictions, there's also a benefit to staying with the current structure because it's already well understood by SaskPower and possibly also better understood by the review panel and other stakeholders here. Our first recommendation is to break out the load function into separate types of generation. We don't see a compelling reason to classify or allocate different types of generation in different ways at this time, but that could change in the future. So it makes sense to have separate subfunctions by different types of generation. And our second recommendation is related to the system operator functions. And system operator is sort of an in-between between generator and transmission. In a deregulated province, the system regulator is a separate entity from either generation or transmission utilities. And vertically integrated utilities like SaskPower, we usually see the system operator as part of the transmission function, but SaskPower includes these subfunctions within the generation function. The activities of the functions are usually considered more transmission activities, so we think SaskPower should consider moving those subfunctions to the transmission function. But again, this would not impact the results and would stray from current practice, so we're not necessarily saying it's something SaskPower really should do, but it's something they should consider. The next slide. Moving on to classification and allocation methodologies. First, we have generation, which is split between demand and energy. Transmission, which is demand-related. And distribution, which is a combination of capacity, so demand-related, and customer-related costs. And customer services are always customer-related. Next slide, please. So taking a look at generation, fuel is a clear energy-related cost. But what about the capital and other fixed costs? So there are 17 generating stations in Saskatchewan, and what drives those costs? Some amount of the cost depends on the amount of electricity being generated, but there also needs to be enough stations, and the stations need to be large enough to generate enough electricity at peak times. If everyone consumed the same amount of energy at all times of the day, a flat load factor, you could get away with having less generation capacity. But in reality, consumption fluctuates throughout the day and throughout the year. So the generating capacity needs to be enough to meet those high demands. So there are a few different ways to do this based on analysis of peak and average demands. Go to the next slide, please. So peak demands can be measured in a few different ways. It could be a single peak or 1 CP, and that looks at only the highest demand hour in the year. But that can fluctuate quite a bit from year to year. On the other end, there's the 12 CP, which is the sum of the peak hour in each month. So if you look at each month individually and find the peak, you add up all 12 hours and you get the 12 CP. There are many variations in between to look at peaks for 3 hours or 4 hours, or look at monthly peaks at different seasons. Another options are to ignore the monthly aspect of this calculation entirely and look at a wide range in peaks hours. For example, one utility just looks at the top 300 peak hours of the year, and they could all be in the same day. They could be a number of days in a row that are the same day, but the peak hour is just the top 300 hours of the year. With the peak demand defined, the next step is to look for a relationship between peak demand and average demand. Go to the next slide, please. There are a few ways to weigh energy requirements versus capacity requirements. The average and excess method looks at average demands and each rate class's peak demands. The peak demand is in excess of average demand, or the peak demand in excess of average demand is considered demand related, and the remainder is considered average demand or energy related. The next one, the equivalent peaker method, starts by separating assets and costs into costs deemed to be serving peak demands and costs deemed to be serving average demands, or sort of more like base load demands. Peak demands are then classified as demand related, and average demands are considered energy related. The base and peak method is similar to equivalent peaker, but the method also considers average demands as another form of sort of demand related. Then there are judgmental energy weightings, which could be as simple as saying 50% is demand related and 50% is energy related. In 2017, Olympus recommended that SAS Power move from the equivalent peaker method to the average and excess methodology, and this change has been implemented. Go to the next slide, please. So there are a few other methods that are quite complex, and we don't see them being used elsewhere, so we won't get too into them right now. Go to the next slide, please. SAS Power uses the average and excess method. The costs classified as energy-related are allocated to classes based on each class's share of total energy consumption, adjusted for losses. And the demand-related costs are allocated based on the 2CP. And the 2CP in this context means there is two coincident peak periods, the first being 3 winter months and the second being 3 summer months. So another way of considering it is it could be considered a 6CP. And this reflects SAS Power's two peaking periods, one in the winter and one in the summer. Next slide, please. The transmission costs are classified fully as demand-related, and this is common among utilities, and Olympus has agreed with this methodology in the past. Again, demands are allocated based on 2CP allocator. The next slide. With distribution, there are some differences among subfunctions. Lines and transformers are classified between demand-related and customer-related based on the minimum system method. This method assigns certain costs attributable to reaching each customer based on a hypothetical minimum system with little to no demand. So it determines what that would cost, what this hypothetical no demand system would cost, and then any costs in excess of that are considered demand-related. Then substations are classified as fully demand-related. The more upstream costs, like sub-transmission stations, are allocated based on the system peak, that 2CP, but demand-related costs that are downstream and closer to the customer are allocated based on a non-coincident peak. This means instead of looking at the system peak time and looking at who is consuming electricity at that peak time, the peak demands of each individual class, irrespective of the demands of other classes, is used. And when it comes to upstream assets, it matters who else is using the system at that time. But when it comes to assets that are closer to the customer, it's the demand of those closer customers that matters. SAS Power has used rounded figures for its classification. So lines are classified as 70% demand and 30% customer related. The results of the minimum system study indicate that lines are 68.5% customer related and 31.5% demand related. So they're just rounded to the closest 5%. And rounding is common, and sometimes these types of studies are used as a test of reasonableness for existing classification factors. But here we're recommending that SAS Power use the actual figures, the more specific figures. So use the 68.5% and 31.5% instead of the 70 and 30%. If the results of the study change over time, it's better to have the gradual change implemented over time. Because if it changed 1% from study to study, it would make more sense to apply that each year rather than wait a few years and then apply a full 5% change all at once. Next slide. So moving on to SAS Power's rate design methodology. Again, SAS Power uses the common methodology of basic monthly charges and energy charges for smaller customers, and basic monthly charges, energy charges, and demand charges for larger customers. From an economic perspective and price signal perspective, it would be ideal to have these three charges for all customers, but in practice, it's unpractical to have demand meters for smaller customers. So that's why smaller customers have only the energy charge and basic monthly charge. The next slide, please. Okay, so time of use rates. SAS Power does not currently have time of use rates. And this is something Olympus discussed in previous studies, and we're including it here again because there's good economic rationale for all utilities, including SAS Power, to move to time of use rates. Time of use rates apply different energy charges at different times of the day and season. So it costs more to generate electricity at peak times, and peak demands are what are driving many of SAS Power's other investments. So it makes sense to charge more at peak times and less in off-peak times. It would be an effective price signal to customers to shift some consumption to off-peak times. is more effective in systems with low load factors. And so we see that Saskatchewan isn't quite as peaky as some other provinces. So the benefits likely won't be as significant, but there will still be cost benefits to customers. One of the main barriers of implementing time of use rates is good hourly data. So following the current rollout of advanced metering infrastructure, SAS Power will have the data to set effective time of use rates and get the load data needed to properly bill customers. So we're not recommending for SAS Power to adopt time of use rates right now. They're not really in a position to do that right now, but we encourage SAS Power to keep it on their mind and to more formally revisit the concept once they have some of the better data in place.
Actually, Andrew, if I can just jump in there for a minute.
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify that we do actually have time of use rates for our power class customers, for our large industrials. We don't have them for our mass market customers, such as residential and farm and commercial. And the power class rates that we do have for time of use, they actually have a very low differential on them. It's only a 1 cent differential between on and off peak. And it's exactly for the reasons that you've outlined here. Because of our high system load factor, it's very hard to find a high value level between the on and off peaks because our marginal costs of energy don't change. So I just wanted to clarify that we actually do have time of use rates for our large industrial customers.
Right. Thank you. That's a good clarification. Yeah, but for the residential customers and smaller commercial customers.
Correct.
And those are the customers that tend to be more peaky anyway. They have higher swings in consumption throughout the day and seasons.
Yep. Exactly. Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
So next slide. We also want to note here a rate design change that occurred since the last review. The typical rate design is to recover fixed customer-related costs through the basic monthly charge, demand-related costs through the demand charge, and energy-related costs through an energy charge. But for larger rate classes, SAS Power used to make an adjustment known as the coincident peak allocation methodology, or the Bary correction. And this adjustment was made to the cost allocated to a class. So it didn't impact the cost allocation, but impacted rate design. So it's just within the class. And it's because costs are largely driven by peak demands, the demands at peak times, the large use customers pay demand charges based on their highest demand each month, whether that demand was during the system peak or not. Customers with consistent demand were more likely to have high demands in peak times than customers with demands that fluctuate over time. So if you consider two customers with the same monthly demand, and therefore they pay the same demand charges on their total bill, it's the customer with the more consistent consumption or the higher overall consumption that is causing more of the demand costs than the customer with the lower fluctuating consumption. So they made an adjustment to shift costs to be recovered from demand charges to energy charges. This improved the intra-class equity, but provided the incorrect price signal. Customers that self-generated avoided these energy charges, but they're also avoiding part of the demand-related costs that they were causing. So this left more costs to be recovered from the customers that didn't cause those costs to be incurred. So since 2022, SAS Power has been phasing out this adjustment. For the next slide, please. So from a cost allocation perspective, the carbon tax is quite unique. It's caused by generation and essentially is a markup on fuel costs. SAS Power has been directed to include the carbon tax as a separate line item on customer bills. So it's not included in the cost allocation model and is treated more of a rate rider. SAS Power calculates the carbon tax based on losses adjusted energy consumption of each class. And this is exactly how it would be treated in the cost allocation model if it was included in the model with fuel costs. In other jurisdictions with different allocations to fuel costs, there would be a bit more detail needed to allocate costs correctly. But in SAS Power's case, with most of the generation being carbon-emitting generation anyway, and no significant difference in the dispatch of those fuels, this method is appropriate. So even though it's not flowing through the cost allocation model, if it were flowing through the cost allocation model, this would be the appropriate methodology to use. So the next slide. Okay, so now on to the survey results. Next slide. So we surveyed 10 utilities, 8 in Canada and 2 in the United States. In Canada, we surveyed 1 utility in each other province except PEI. And we have a selection of tables in the section in the report, but there's not time to go through all of them today, so we have a sort of subsection of those today. So functionalization is very standardized across North America, and even more so following the transition to IFRS accounting. The functionalization and sub-functionalization of SaskPower's cost are aligned with its system of accounts. Next slide. This table shows the number of generation subfunctions used by each utility. So you can see it's common to have 2 or 3, but some utilities have more. SaskPower has 9 subfunctions, which is on the higher end. But as I mentioned before, there are a few subfunctions that are more system operator type functions. And note that there are 2 utilities, ATCO and Hydro 1, that don't have generation subfunctions because they're deregulated. So those are the 2 at the NA down there. Next slide. This table shows the number of transmission subfunctions. SaskPower has 4 subfunctions. And here I'll point out that all 4 subfunctions are classified in the same way, and it's common for transmission to be fully classified as demand-related. So some utilities, when they move from their financial statements to their cost allocation models, they wouldn't break it out because everything's done the same way anyway. So that's why there are 4 there that it's just the one function. It's because they're going to treat everything the same way anyway, so they just include the entire cost together as one. They don't break it out in the same way. Next slide, please. Here are the functionalized and subfunction results of the distribution function. And there's quite a range here, and SaskPower is at the upper end of the range with 10. Next slide. Finally, here are the results for the customer care function. SaskPower is on the high end here with 6, and that mostly reflects a higher level of detail in the model. Other utilities might have subfunctions like metering and metering services and meter reading together, but SaskPower has them listed separately in the model. Similarly, there's billing and customer accounts and customer collections that are treated as one subfunction in many other utilities, but treated as 2 in SaskPower's. So it's really just a minor difference in the approach, and there's no real right or wrong way to do it, and we don't see any reason to change, even though they are a bit different from the other utilities. Next slide, please. This table shows the classification methodology for generation. SaskPower is in the most common grouping here, with its average and excess being based on the system load factor. Next slide. Next slide, please. Here we have the share of generation classified as demand. And SaskPower is on the lower end here, and that's because it's about 25% is the share of SaskPower's generation costs that are classified as demand. And that's because Saskatchewan has a high load factor and doesn't have significant peaks in one season. So the dual peaking in the winter and summer make it a flatter load factor overall. And so a lower share of its costs are treated as demand related. Next slide. For transmission costs, SaskPower's costs are classified as fully as demand, which is the most common. Next slide. SaskPower's classification method for distribution lines and transformers is based on the minimum system method. Note that there are 3 utilities that use just the minimum system method, and then 3 others that use that method along with the zero intercept method. And the zero intercept method is conceptually similar, but it's just done with a different sort of calculation. So overall, SaskPower is aligned with the common practice in North America. Next slide. So finally, we have the next steps of this process. Next slide. So today is May 17th, and we'll open up the floor for some questions in a minute, but there's a process to submit written questions by May 24th, and we'll respond to those by June 2nd. If you have pretty detailed questions, that might be the best route for you. Stakeholders are invited to file written submissions by June 16th. and then the final report will be delivered on June 30th. So now we'll open up for questions.
Does anybody have any questions? Scott, did you want to jump in and just talk about how customers can ask questions on our webpage?
Sure. Yeah, if there's no questions today, but if something comes to mind after and you would like to submit a written question, what this slide is showing is where on SaskPower's website we include, where we will end up including the transcript from today. We'll have a copy of the previous cost of service study included on there. And the email address that you are to use, if there is in fact a question, was actually on the previous slide. So it's cosreview@saskpower.com.
Andrew, Jerry Forrest, if I could just ask, I'm referring to your draft report that you circulated, and particularly in the tables at page 53, 54, and so on, where you summarize the various allocation methodologies that are used across Canada and the two US utilities. The question I was going to ask you, and I'm just suggesting this for ease when people are looking at this report in the long term, that you add at the bottom of them SaskPower's current methodology in each one of those items.
Sure, that's a good point. I'll add that.
And then if I could just follow up on Rod and your comment on the question of time of use rates. Any cost or benefits associated with the current program, Rod, that you have in place, all of those costs and benefits are contained in those particular customer classes. None of the cost or benefits flow to any other class of customer.
That is correct. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Rod. Then if I go to your specific recommendations, Andrew, particularly the first one where you're suggesting that you break out the load function into a separate functions in the future. Can you give me the sort of an outline reason why?
So we see the breakout in other provinces, and sometimes costs are allocated or they're classified differently based on different types of generation. If there's sort of decisions on what is dispatched at different times, then it would make sense to have the separate types of generation laid out so that certain generation would be classified more towards average demand, and the more peaking plants would be classified as demand related instead. And
So
it also could be useful for setting time of use rates to have the different costs sort of laid out more seasonally and more at different times of the day.
And do you think that would give better signals for SaskPower to use in the future when they're allocating cost?
Yes, it would be good to know. I know SaskPower is definitely aware of the different costs of different types of generation, but it could be useful to have that more laid out and how that is allocated to different classes, and different types of generation might be allocated to different classes in different ways.
Yeah, I guess what I'm just trying to determine in my own mind when I look at these kind of studies for purposes of fairness and reasonable rates for the future, the question is this going to help, or are we trying to determine how many angels can dance on the end of the pin? In other words, are we trying to get too much refinement out of this issue, or is it really important in the cost of service methodology going forward?
I'll say it's not important at this time, so it's not really necessary to do this right now. But if there was a decision to change the classification in the future, even SaskPower knowing that they're capable of doing it, which it sounds like they can implement this if necessary, but it's not something that needs to be done.
Can I add to that, Andrew? It's John Todd. Part of what we do, Jerry, is in reviewing other jurisdictions, other companies. It's sort of getting a sense of what may happen in the future.
Right.
Right now, it's irrelevant, really, for SaskPower. As the market changes, and some of the markets have changed more already in terms of competitive pressures and so on than SaskPower, then the refinements may become relevant for SaskPower as well as it changes. And the reason for the comment is, if 5 years from now, the next review, it becomes relevant to have the more refined approach, if it's in place, it makes it easy to do, and it can make no difference in the meantime. But if it's required, by anticipating the possibility, it's there and ready to draw on if you need it in 5 years, assuming a review every 5 years. Otherwise, it may be 5 years before you get the recommendation and 10 years before you have the refinement. So I guess it's a nice to have, just in case it matters in the future, and you would have it on a more timely basis. But I think from today's perspective, it probably is angels dancing in the head of the pin.
John, I very much appreciate your comment. As we chatted at the last one, this is exactly the kind of thoughts I was hoping would get from you in the cost of service review, because this industry is going through a massive change, and any further data that can be gathered and gathered appropriately will help insofar as plotting a plan going forward. So I don't want you to take the comments that I made to Andrew as negative. I'm just trying to get an understanding of what he was trying to do and why. And I got that. So I appreciate the answer there insofar as that. And I'm just trying to get to also some clarification on some of the recommendations that you have here, where you're talking about scheduling, dispatch, regulation, and frequency, moving it out of generation and into transmission. Again, I'm just trying in the back of my mind, try to understand the reasons for that going forward. Is that also sort of a refinement into ensuring that you have the appropriate data points in the future if you're going to change direction on the cost of service study?
That's similarly, it's just more for the future. One thing is if you want to compare the share of costs that relate to generation and transmission and distribution, just knowing that those costs are included in a different category elsewhere be helpful for that analysis. And if, again, with the way some provinces are changing and the industry is going, that these specific functions are often not even included in the utility. They're a separate entity.
Yeah.
Good to include those together and more aligned with where we see this. Often transmission and system operator is the name of the function rather than just transmission. So I think lining it up with the other provinces that we reviewed, some logic to it from that perspective.
Okay. Now, John, you're obviously online here. When I'm reflecting in the past where we used to do this, where we would have phase one, which is the cost of service study itself and the review of it, and then we'd go to phase two, which was rate design. In your report, you don't deal with rate design in any significant way. You've dealt with it with respect to the three components, but I guess one of the questions that I had in the back of my mind is, a great deal of the cost to the consumer today is a blended rate between those that are on the customer charge and the energy charge. Is there a thought that in the long term we should have more clarity on the customer cost side and how much we're going to generate revenue in the blended rate relative to what that fixed cost component actually is. Has there been any thought, or have you given any thought to that matter?
Jerry, as usual, you ask questions where you know the answer in advance, and you want us to share it with the rest of the group. And by the way, in that vein, with these questions and any questions that other parties submit after the fact, the questions and responses will be included in the final report. I mean, for these questions, there's a transcript, so it'll be included in the transcript of this discussion. Any questions are documented for clarification purposes in the future. As to your question, Andrew and I were talking about it earlier in the process, and technically this is a cost of service review, and rate design is out of scope.
Yeah, okay.
We considered it relevant, and SAS Power accepted that we pushed the boundaries on that a little bit in the discussion of time of use rates. And what you raise is issues that are very important in the industry generally. We are involved actually in a couple of other proceedings across the country that are struggling with some of the rate design issues. They are the considerations, customer focus, impacts on customers, industry structure, all those factors that are relevant get drilled down into a lot of detail. And Rod may want to speak to, or Scott, to the fact that I know SAS Power is doing a lot of thinking about these issues. For example, the CRS rate process that was that now, Rod, a couple years ago? I mean, that was a rate design issue.
Right.
And they are very concerned, as is everybody in the industry, including us, about how we evolve the design of rates in order to encourage efficiency, to create better signals to customers as to how they cause costs. And some of those changes are dependent upon the technology for recording electricity use and for billing. So, for example, the theoretically ideal rate structure has a customer charge which recovers the customer-related costs, an energy charge that recovers the energy-related costs, demand charge recovers demand-related costs for all classes. At the present time with SAS Power and most other utilities across the country, you do not record demands, peak demands of customers in the smaller customer classes. Just the metering doesn't do that. With the implementation of AMI, that capability is coming. When you go down some of these paths, there can be very significant impacts on customer bills, i.e., in a sense, shifting cost responsibility. That makes changes complicated issues. So I guess what I'm saying is that I hear your concerns, SAS Power hears your concerns. It's sort of out of scope, but I'm sure those kinds of issues there'll be further discussion between the rate review panel and SAS Power, and who knows, maybe us, on dealing with some of these issues, because the pressures are there to create these changes. And one of the things we're observing is when there are changes in one province, people in other provinces see that.
Yeah. And
there are at least some customers who say, oh, we should be following suit. And there's good reasons for those changes. So in terms of this report, I'd have to say we scratched the surface. But your comment raises the point that this will be a future issue for SAS Power and the panel.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. Maybe Rod can give us some further highlights of what they're thinking of in the long term to help us and help the panel, particularly because they're recognizing more so than ever that the future is less clear than certainly the past.
Yeah, that's correct, Jerry. I think John hit it on the head here, that technology and data is going to be a key factor for us going forward in terms of our ability to design more types of rates, more innovative rates, time of use rates potentially, and that's why we are very much looking forward to our AMI project being completed and getting all of that data consolidated together, and so we're able to do some testing to try and do exactly that, to sort of test the water, so to speak, and see what exactly we can do in terms of designing new innovative rates, and also being cognizant of the impact that these rates can have on certain jurisdictions. So, for example, it was mentioned that utilities generally don't have demand rates for low usage customers.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that if in a perfect world everybody would be on a demand meter, but there's some reasons why we don't do it, and one of them is that demand rates can be very, very punitive to low load factor customers, low usage, low load factor customers. So the trick is how do we design a rate that can provide those price incentives, recover adequate costs, but not be overly punitive to these customers who are just, they're peaky, their consumption is all over the map, they're not using a lot. How do we do this? And that's really the challenge that we're facing. And as was mentioned before, I think everybody is facing it at this point. And I think once we get our AMI data and we can really see what's going on, we can drill down into those classes and see what's happening, I think we're going to be in a much better position.
And Rod,
flag,
that's it.
Oh, sorry, I'd flag that with Rod's comments that he touched on, but I want to highlight that the solution to the issues that need to be addressed are not purely technical. For example, one of the rationales for not having demand charges for small volume customers, and we led a process, I think it was 10 years ago or more, at the Ontario Energy Board, looking at demand charges for low volume customers, just when Ontario was getting into smart meters. But there's customer diversity. And if you've got customer diversity and you're thinking of customers as a class, is it conceptually appropriate to have a rate where customers pay for their individual peak demand when the system, in a sense, only has to respond to aggregate demand, peak demand, or on individual feeders at least, and things like that? It's not in a simplistic way. There are simplistic solutions, but when you actually think about it more deeply, some of those apparently straightforward solutions don't make sense. And that's why I was trying to be very cautious in the previous comments that these things have to be considered, but what's being done elsewhere isn't necessarily an appropriate example for SaskPower. And all across North America, around the world, these issues are being struggled with. And I think I have to say that the solutions that people are coming up with across jurisdictions differ, and there's conflicting views as to what is the right thing to do.
Yeah, John, you and Rod both have this in hand. All I'm trying to illustrate to all here that the future on all of these issues is complicated. There's really probably no simple one solution to all, but it's really important that everyone understands that there's clarity in the cost of serving it to, and the services that they acquire on a day-to-day basis. It's just important to them to know so they can take whatever action they feel is appropriate. But at the same point in time, then they know that if they're going to go for supplemental generation or whatever, what the cost and benefits of that is going to be to them personally.
Absolutely.
Great job, John, Andrew, and Rod. Certainly from my point of view, the report is very helpful. Certainly the panel, I expect, will be following the question back and forth, and indeed, if it would be possible to ensure that the panel is made aware of the significance of the questions that may be posed going forward.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? we still have time. So, oh,
Well, I was just going to say that if there are no further questions, I'm sure nobody will mind getting a little bit of time back into their day. So again, I think on behalf of SAS Power and Alenkis, we'd like to thank you for your time today to listen to the findings and the review of our cost of service methodology. And why don't we just advance one last time, Rod, and we'll just show exactly, there's the email address if you do have a further question, cosreview@saspower.com. And any additional information that came from today's meeting or from previous discussions can be found on SAS Power's website. Just advance one, Rod.
no, that's it.
Okay.
Yep, we're done.
Yep, there it is there on hitting accounts and then going onto the right-hand side onto the cost of service page.
Andrew, can you forward me a copy of the presentation you had today?
Sure.
Appreciate that.
Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Take care.